We're surrounded by information about what's happening in the world all the time. But have you ever stopped to wonder why one massive humanitarian crisis can completely dominate the news for months, while another one that's just as bad barely makes a peep? Well, it turns out that might not be an accident at all. So today, we're going to dive into a new framework that tries to explain how the visibility of a conflict can be systematically engineered.
Okay, let's just take 2023 as an example. The war in Ukraine, a truly horrific conflict, got something like 85% of all international conflict coverage. But at the same time, the civil war in Sudan, which caused one of the biggest displacement crises on the planet, with comparable levels of suffering, it only got about 5%. I mean, that's a 17-to-1 difference. It's huge. And here's the thing, our standard models for predicting news coverage, based on stuff like how severe a crisis is or how close it is geographically, they just can't explain a gap that big. In fact, those models consistently leave this massive hole in their explanations. Somewhere between 50 and 70% of the difference in media attention is just unexplained. And for decades, a lot of folks have just kind of shrugged this off as statistical noise or random chance, or maybe factors that are just too complicated to even measure. It's the part of the equation that just gets left behind.
But here's the big question. What if that's not just random noise? What if that massive, unexplained gap is actually a signal? A signal that points to deliberate, strategic, and even measurable manipulation of what we pay attention to. And that's the core idea we're going to unpack today. A way to detect how a crisis becomes visible or invisible completely on purpose.
So before we even get into how this works, we need to talk about why it matters so much. Because this isn't just some interesting academic puzzle. In the world we live in, a world saturated with information, attention is probably the single scarcest resource there is. And when you're talking about humanitarian crises, who gets that attention can literally be a matter of life and death.
It all flows through something we can call the attention pipeline. See, there's a really clear direct line here. Media attention, step one, leads to public awareness. That awareness then creates pressure on governments and donors to provide funding. And that funding is what pays for the actual humanitarian response on the ground, the food, the medicine, the shelter. So you see, if a crisis doesn't get that first step, attention, it basically has no chance of ever getting to step 5. This creates a huge incentive for people to try and control that very first step, to either amplify it or to suppress it.
All right, so if this is happening, what do we even call it? Well, the framework we're looking at today gives this phenomenon a name. It actually borrows a term we're all pretty familiar with, but it applies it in a really new and powerful way.
The term for this is attention laundering. Let's break that down because it's a mouthful. It's about systematically manipulating the flow of information. But here's the key. It's not done directly. It's done through intermediaries or proxy channels. And the goal is very specific, to make a conflict either incredibly visible or to make it practically disappear, leading to an outcome that looks nothing like what you'd expect just based on how bad the crisis actually is.
Now, to really get a grip on this, it's super helpful to see what it's not. We all know about financial laundering. That's about making dirty money look clean. And some of you may have heard of information laundering, which is about making false claims look true. But attention laundering is different. Its goal is to control the spotlight on real events. And this is absolutely critical. It's not about making up lies. It's about taking a real crisis, a true event, and either cranking up the volume to 11 or hitting the mute button, making it seem forgotten or like we've already heard too much about it.
Okay, so that's the what. But how does it actually work? Well, this framework suggests that the manipulation happens through 3 main channels. You can think of them as the basic tools in the toolkit.
All right, first up, we've got the credibility channel. This is all about transferring legitimacy. A story or a narrative gains authority not because of its own merits, but because of who's telling it. Getting your story placed in a big-name newspaper, a respected research institute, or having influential experts talk about it. The idea is to build a consensus among the elites that then trickles down and shapes how everybody else sees the crisis.
Next, there's the resource channel. And this one is all about brute force, just flooding the zone. It's about having the capacity, the infrastructure to generate and coordinate a huge amount of content. We're talking about things like bot networks or massive content farms. And the key here isn't just the sheer volume, it's the coordination. It's about making a manufactured campaign look like a genuine, organic wave of public interest or disinterest.
And finally, we have channel number 3, Contagion. This one measures how effectively a message spreads, its virality. A campaign with high contagion is designed to jump from one community to another, to break out of its echo chamber. This is where you see things like hashtag campaigns or influencer networks being used to rocket a message across totally different platforms and audiences.
So what happens when you start mixing and matching these three channels, credibility, resource, and contagion? Well, you start to see these distinct patterns emerge. The framework lays out four main signatures, almost like fingerprints, that can help us figure out what kind of manipulation might be going on.
Think of these patterns as a kind of diagnostic toolkit. For instance, a whitewash uses high credibility but not much else. It's about getting the elites to agree a story isn't important, so it just fades away. A flood is the opposite. It uses huge resources and high contagion to just drown out a story with pure noise. An eclipse is the most complex. It combines high credibility and high resources for total information dominance. And then you have a breakout, which is when a story just goes viral on its own, with high contagion even without any major backing.
Okay, this is a really important point. Not every invisible crisis is the result of some big deliberate scheme. Sometimes it's just plain hard for information to get out. And the framework accounts for this with a really useful concept called friction. Friction is basically anything that creates resistance and makes it hard for information to flow. It can be technical, like a government shutting down the internet. It can be about journalists, the real physical danger of reporting from a war zone or being denied a visa. And it can also be algorithmic, where a social media platform's own system ends up demoting certain kinds of content. The main takeaway here is that friction is often just a structural problem, not some active conspiracy.
Okay, so we've got the channels, the patterns, and this idea of friction. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, that huge gap between Ukraine and Sudan, and see how this new lens helps us make sense of it.
When you put it all together, the picture becomes so much clearer. For Ukraine, the friction was super low. Information could get out easily. You combine that with extremely high contagion. Stories were just going viral constantly, and the result was total full-spectrum amplification. For Sudan, it was the exact opposite. Friction was about 7 times higher because of things like internet shutdowns and the immense danger to journalists. Contagion was incredibly low. Stories really struggled to spread. The pattern here looks a lot like a whitewash, where high friction and a lack of elite attention just combine to make a crisis invisible. And notice, the framework isn't pointing fingers here. It's just describing the mechanics that led to such different outcomes. Which brings us to probably the most important part of all of this. When you have a tool this powerful for diagnosing what's going on, you have to be incredibly responsible with it. The whole point here is to diagnose what's happening at a systems level, not to just start throwing around accusations without proof.
So the framework really comes with its own code of conduct, you could say. Rule number 1, focus on the patterns, not trying to name names. 2, always be upfront about uncertainty. This is about finding plausible ranges, not claiming you have perfect, precise answers. 3rd, remember this is a diagnostic tool. It is not a courtroom verdict. And maybe most importantly, this is a scientific framework. It's designed to be tested, to be challenged, and to be improved. Or maybe even proven wrong. It's meant to start a better conversation, not to end it.
So in the end, this whole framework really changes how we think about power in the 21st century. It suggests that one of the most powerful forms of control isn't just about shaping what people think. It's about determining what they get to think about in the first place. And that forces us to ask a really heavy question. What happens when invisibility itself becomes a weapon?